So hello, everyone, and welcome to session 2 of the Part C SPP APR Indicator 12 Office Hours series. On behalf of my colleagues and I, we're happy to have you for our second session. I'm going to review our agenda for today. So first, we'll discuss reporting data in Indicator C12, including required data and optional reporting. Then we will talk about describing data for C12 in the narrative sections of your report with some suggested content and narrative for those sections. And then we'll open it up for questions from you. And at the end, we'll share resources. But on the next slide, before we get into the content for today, we would like to know more about you and your role in writing the narrative for Indicator 12 in your APR. So you should see a poll pop up on your screen. We'd like you to share more about your role in the poll. Are you involved in writing the narrative for Indicator 12 in your APR? So if you can choose one of those options and then hit submit. All right, so most look like they're leading, or at least on the team. And then there's a few that are not involved. So, and there was no one that answered, I have no idea. So we have either not involved or on the team or leading. So thank you for sharing that with us so we can get a better idea. All right, so now we will review reporting data in Indicator 12. So on Indicator 12, required data, there's 4 areas we're going to review for required reporting data. First, we have findings identified and reported in SPP APR compliance indicators C1, C7, and C8A, 8B, and 8C, and those are pre-populated. Then we have findings on IDEA-related requirements for those same indicators, C1, C7, C8A, 8B, and 8C, not identified and above, and found through monitoring, either cyclical or targeted monitoring or other, and other components of general supervision, such as dispute resolution, fiscal, and any other areas you would use to monitor IDEA requirements. For the third one, we have findings corrected and verified from number 1 and number 2 above, if applicable. And then fourth, we have findings of noncompliance that were not corrected within 1 year of written notification from number 1 and number 2, if applicable. I'm going to put in the chat for you for our next slide. A resource for you. So now we will look at an example. So this example is reporting required data related to Indicator 7. And Indicator 7 says the percentage of infants and toddlers with IFSPs for whom initial evaluation, initial assessment, and the initial IFSP meeting were conducted within Part C's 45-day timeline. So in the table, we have the findings of noncompliance identified in fiscal year 2023. And in that first column, we have column A, that was the number of written findings of noncompliance identified, and that was 7. In column B, we have the number of any other written findings of noncompliance identified. And then in the third column, we have column C1, the number of written findings of noncompliance from column A that were timely corrected. And in this example, there were 7 identified in column A, and all 7 were corrected in C1. Then C2, we have the number of written findings of noncompliance from column B that were timely corrected, and there were 0. And then in column D, the number of written findings of noncompliance from columns A and B for which correction was not completed or timely. So then underneath, you see in parentheses, we have A plus B. So that would be 7 plus 2 minus C1 plus C2, 7 plus 0. And we have 2 that were left that were not completed or timely corrected. And then at the bottom, it says additional 2 findings were listed on requirements related to prior notice. So that's just additional information there. All right, so next we have our optional reporting for Indicator 12. For optional reporting, you may report other findings of noncompliance that are not specific to the compliance indicators, but that are related to the following: results indicators and their IDEA-related requirements, dispute resolution, fiscal, and any other areas you use to monitor IDEA requirements. For the second area, this would be findings corrected and verified in number 1, which we just reviewed, if applicable. And then the third area would be findings of noncompliance that were not corrected within 1 year from written notice from number 1 and number 2, if applicable. We also have a note we'd like to share here that in future years, states may be required to further disaggregate findings by result indicator, like indicators 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 10, and 11, fiscal and other areas. So there may need to be more disaggregation in future years. Okay, let's look at an example of reporting optional data. So in this example, I have to make it bigger. This example is for federal fiscal year 2024 and 2025, and it's all other findings. States may report here on all other findings of noncompliance that were not reported under the compliance indicators above. So in column B, we have the number of written findings of noncompliance, which is 12. In column C2, we have the number of written findings of noncompliance from column B that were not timely corrected. And then in column D, we have the number of written findings of noncompliance from column B for which correction was not completed or timely corrected. And we only have 1 listed there. And then underneath, we have specific findings that were issued related to the following. And it just breaks down the different findings and the numbers within each. So now I think I will turn it over to Anne.
Thank you so much, Sharisa. I get the pleasure of trying to provide information to you around how to write the narrative related to several aspects associated with the required reporting as well as the optional reporting. And we're going to cover several different topics. And let's go to the next slide. And I will show you the 3 main areas that we're going to focus on. So under the compliance indicator tables in C12, C1, C7, C8A, C8B, C8C, these 3 items are included there as narrative boxes, information that you must describe. These 3 same boxes or headers and the same boxes are under the optional reporting if you choose to report optional information. And I do want to point out that we have pulled this information from the new FFY 2024 APR template. And the number 1 item that you see in blue on the screen is new for C1, C7, C8A, C8B, C8C in Indicator C12. These are not in the individual indicators in the APR. That particular item is only in C12, but it was in there under the optional reporting last year. The header that was in last year's reporting for the compliance indicators in C12 was around having to explain the differences in the numbers of findings that were issued for the actual indicator, like C1 versus the additional findings that you were reporting. So they wanted to know more information about that. And they've changed it this year to talk more about the source. Any questions about that before I go on? Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about each of those three sections separately, and I'm going to start with the sources of noncompliance, which is the first item that's new. So for the compliance indicators in C12, C1, C7, C8A, C8A, C8B, and C8C, what we are encouraging that you do is that you include the number of findings that were issued for that particular indicator that you're reporting in. So if you're reporting under the table C1, then report that there were 10 findings issued for X number of programs. Or if you're doing it under CHC, then you would do it specific for the timely services requirement. And then we also want you to include the numbers of additional findings or those findings that what we're calling are related to the indicator, such as the IDEA related requirements that hopefully you've already begun to identify based on the other areas beyond the SPP APR that you are actually monitoring. So again, these additional findings, we want you to report how many of those findings that you had issued. And Susan, I see you have a question.
Hi, Anne. So would you recommend if we have, 2 or 3 different sources of information that we used that resulted in findings, that we list the number by source? Is that what you're saying? So like, for example, I had 3 findings identified through state monitoring. I had 4 that came through dispute resolution, whatever those were. Is that what you're saying? Those different sources?
And by, I would do that,
And then,
Susan, by the compliance indicator. So if you're doing it for C1, do exactly what you said for C1. If you have multiple, which you may not for C1, it may
right,
be your
right,
data system. So
right.
specify that. And then for the other additional findings, you could list, child records or whatever other source you were using for
Okay,
those two. Yeah, but
okay,
definitely, I think how you're approaching it is exactly what we would recommend.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and the sources, as Susan was talking about, it could be an administrative complaint, or it could be cyclical or targeted monitoring, as Susan was talking about. It could even be like fiscal monitoring. Maybe there are some things that are incorporated that you've gathered through fiscal monitoring, which I know some states are doing. For example, you may be looking at whether the services that were provided on the that are listed on the IFSP were actually provided. Some states look at that information as part of their fiscal monitoring rather than more programmatic monitoring. And that might be a related requirement to Indicator 1, for example. So now I want to mention for the other findings, like if the optional, those things that are optional and you choose to report them, we want you to definitely report those by the number of findings by source. But it's important for the compliance indicators that you say your source for the compliance indicator itself, and then for the other additional findings that you kind of list them out in terms of what those sources were. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Now I'm going to talk about number 2 on that first slide that I talked about, and this is the verification of systems level correction when you use updated data to verify correction. And I believe all of you know that to verify correction, that you have to look at systems level correction as well as the individual child level correction. So there are 2 parts, and that's the first part, the systems level correction, is what I'm going to talk about now. So again, what we're encouraging you to do is to describe how you verified correction for the indicator. Now, we know that you described that in your actual APR indicator. So let's just, I'll use an example of C1 right now. So let's just say that you had 10 findings that you reported in indicator 1 on their correction. You reported on how you verified the systems level correction by pulling updated data. Hopefully your C1 description will be in more detail than in C12. C12 needs to have more or less of a summary of how you verified the correction, how much data did you pull, that kind of thing, which I will cover in just a moment. But you should describe that, and then separately, you should describe by the actual IDEA related requirement kind of the same thing. Now, I say that because there may be different information for each of those items. So, for example, in C1, if you are looking at parent consent for the services to be provided, that might be one item that you report how you verified correction, because your sources, the amount of information, and other types of information that we're going to ask you to include may be different from, say, for example, what you look at and the amount of data that you pull if you're looking at whether the services were actually provided that were on the IFSP. So we're asking you to look at them a little bit separately. And similarly, when you're doing your optional reporting, if you choose to do that, again, we really want you to describe it separately by IDEA requirement, because again, the information that we're suggesting that you include may vary across those requirements. And what we are suggesting that you include in this description is the data source, which could be your data system, it could be child records, whatever that source is that you're looking at to verify correction of that particular requirement. And then we also are suggesting that you include actually how much data you did pull. For example, it could be that you pulled 1 month of data for the transition conference, but then you had monitored one of the IDEA related requirements that you monitored was the LEA was invited to the transition conference. Well, you don't have that data in your data system, so you may need to pull like 10% of child records to look at that to determine if the program is now at 100% compliance and correctly implementing the requirement. Let's go on to the next slide. So a few more things that'll be really important in this section. This is a good section, even though, as you know, you have to do both prongs. And I say the word prongs loosely, but you have to do the updated data review and the program has to be at 100%. And then the next section that we're going to be talking about is the individual case correction. You have to do both of those in order to ensure that timely correction has occurred. But it's important somewhere in your narrative that you summarize the number of findings that were timely corrected for each of those areas and those that were not. So again, you'd want to do that just very briefly for the compliance indicator itself, and then separately for those IDEA related requirements. And then over in the optional area, do it separately by IDEA requirement. And then if there are any particular items, requirements that were not timely corrected, to describe very briefly any required actions that were taken to help ensure subsequent correction as soon as possible. So let's go on to the next slide. So I want to give you a couple tips. What we have heard from OSAP is that they're not looking for a cut and paste from the actual indicator. When you're writing about C1 in the indicator, they're not looking for just a cut and paste and put it into the C12 under indicator 1. Now, I know that's been challenging for some because many of you do not have a lot of detail in the actual indicator. What OSAP has shared, they're looking more for a summary of that information, but provide more information then about the related requirements, because there's no other place where you've reported any information about that. It's really important, though, that what you describe is in past tense, not present or not future tense. And it is about what you as a state did to verify the correction of findings. OSAP is not looking for a general description of your state process, but they're looking for information that's specific to what you did, and make sure it's all in past tense and you're talking specifically about the findings that you issued in FFY 2023 and how you verified their correction. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, we wanted to just show you just a quick snippet of some information from indicator 1 to indicator 12. And we're just talking very briefly about the amount and the source of the data that was pulled to look at for a particular, for C1. So in indicator 1, for indicator 1, you basically, in this example, pull 1 month of data. And through that pull, you discovered that the program is now at 100% and correctly implementing timely services requirements. And you notice the terminology that we use there, 100% compliance and correctly implementing timely services. Though that is language from OSEP QA 2301, and it's important that you include language from 2301 in your description. Now, given that in C12, hopefully you have more information and more detail, and you could write something similar to this if all of the data that you're collecting for each finding is the same in C1. In indicator C1, though, in C12, you might have same language, which is what we have here just as an example. But then as you're looking at the related requirement of obtaining written parental consent prior to implementing the IFSP services. On that particular item, you had to pull 10% of child records, and through that review, you verified that the program was at 100% and correctly implementing the requirement. So let's go on to the next slide. So now we're going to talk just very briefly about verification of correction for individual cases. So similar to what we talked about for the systemic level correction, what we are suggesting that you do is to also report the total number of individual cases of noncompliance by finding that broken down by the SPP APR indicator and those IDEA related requirements that are associated with the indicator, or if you're reporting in optional data, then by the results indicator, their related requirements, fiscal or whatever. So, and then include the data source that you use to review the correction at the individual level, and the number of instances or cases of noncompliance where correction had occurred, and then the number of cases where correction has not yet been occurred by each. So break those down again as well. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to be passing it over to Ginger, but I see Sarah has a question. Sarah said, our response didn't include all the components either. So then OSEP says that the findings weren't corrected. But if we did correct the findings, but we didn't, do we continue to report those as findings not corrected for next year? Okay, Sarah, I think I get the gist. One of the things, I did an analysis of 18 SPP APRs, and I can tell you that 9 out of the 18 had basically somewhat similar information as to what you're sharing here. And the reason is that how the information, again, was described was not described in a manner in which it was needed to be described in order to be corrected. I believe you got a comment from OSEP, and I can't remember for C12 what the response said, whether you had to report your response to their required action in C12 for this year, which would be pretty much similar to what you needed to do in the individual indicator. There's a place under their required action where you can provide the response, particularly if you did not describe the information correctly in the prior year. That may be one place. I know that there were other places that states have also reported information, like in the actual narrative itself, just to clarify. I think I need to see your actual data and OSEP's response before providing like a clear idea of where you might want to consider reporting it. Or you could also ask your OSEP state lead now, since they're back. And Ginger, would you like to take the opportunity now to provide the example?
Absolutely. So we spoke with Stacy Kong in Hawaii, and she, as some of you know, she shared at the Data Institute. And We asked her if she'd be willing for us to share her data and narrative examples here with you all as well, and she agreed. So she was not able to attend, but we will be talking through her data and comparing her narratives between indicators 1 and indicator 12. So when we look at the next slide, you can see this is these are the numbers that they reported for indicator 12 related to indicator 1. So in column A, they had 5 findings that were pulled from the indicator 1 tables. They added 1 in column B, so they had 1 additional finding, and this was related to written consent. Column C1 pulled from indicator 1, and they had reported that 3 of the 5 were corrected, timely corrected. In C2, they added another 1, saying that the finding in column B had been corrected timely. And so as Sharissa had gone through sort of the calculation, 4 out of the 6 were corrected timely, and so 2 remained uncorrected. So these are the data that were in C12 for last year's APR. And so when they went in to explain this, we want to, on the next slide, we're going to give you a little bit of the indicator 1 narrative. So you can kind of see the differences between what they reported for indicator 1 and what they reported for 12. So for indicator 1, this is how they explained their sort of the subsequent review process. So how they looked at updated data to verify that the programs were demonstrating systemic compliance. So they presented information about each program. And we didn't include everything on the slide, obviously, because we just don't have space for that. So wanted to mention that the amounts of data that they mention here are based on the written review requirements that they use that depend on the program's monitoring data percentage. So some programs, they look at 1 month of data, some programs, they look at 2 months of data, and so forth. So that's what that's referring to. So they described in a lot of detail what they looked at, how much data was submitted for each program, and they reported that 3 of the 5 programs, remember there were 5 findings for indicator 1, 3 of the 5 programs demonstrated correction when they looked at their updated data. Okay, 1 of the 5 programs submitted their data. They demonstrated subsequent correction. Okay, it was not timely corrected, but it was subsequently corrected. And then there was 1 remaining program that had not yet demonstrated compliance. So that's sort of the summary of the 5 findings that they had made for the additional data review. So how did they report this in 12? So on the next slide, you can see that they started by summarizing those 5 findings. Okay, so of the 18 programs in the state, 6 were issued a total of 6 findings of noncompliance. So remember, 1 of those 6 was a related requirement finding about written consent. So 5 of the findings were related to indicator 1 they summarized, and 1 finding was related to the related requirement. And so they summarized how they did that. To verify correction of noncompliance for each of those, they reviewed required evidence from the respective programs and reviewed whether they were at 100% compliance. So that's sort of the introductory section that they used. In the next slide, they go into a little bit more detail about the data that they reviewed. So some of this is very similar to what they reported under C1, and some of it is new to 12 because of that additional finding. So indicator 1, their timely services, they summarized the data that they looked at. So they didn't go through those monthly descriptions, how much data they pulled by month. Instead, they said we looked at lists of data These were the data points we looked at. They did a worksheet review to check that each IFSP had been reviewed and so forth. And then they provided a similar description of the data they looked at for that written consent finding. So you can sort of see the differences between 1 and 12 here. There are some similarities between the two. You know, you have to summarize what was in indicator 1, but just differences in the level of detail. So the next slide finishes up their review of the narrative that they provided about that updated data review. So they concluded, after looking at all of that data, that 4 of those 6 total findings, remember 5 plus 1, were verified as timely corrected within 1 year. 3 of those were for indicator 1. 1 of the timely corrected findings was that related requirement. 1 of the 6 findings was verified as demonstrating subsequent correction. Remember, we saw that they had reported that same thing in indicator 1. And then 1 of the 6 findings was not verified as corrected. So they go through some additional detail about their next steps, the enforcement actions, and so forth. Okay. And you can look at this, all of the detail and the little, you know, some of the additional information that we weren't able to put on the slide. You can go and pull down the Hawaii SPP APR to look at this in more detail if you want to see that. And then on the final slide that we have, we wanted to provide a little bit of information about how they reported verification of correction for the individual cases, the individual child cases. So they had 52 individual cases of noncompliance across the 6 programs. 51 of those were related to indicator 1. And then they had 1 related to that written consent issue. And so that middle paragraph there, where that starts of the 51 cases related to indicator 1, that is extremely similar to the narrative they wrote for indicator 1. So it's just a slight summary and rewording of the list of cases and the outcomes of those. Okay, so 36 received their services though late, 11 were no longer residing, etc. And then they provide that information about that final individual case that is only relevant to indicator 12. And so that consent was subsequently obtained to provide consent to continue to provide services. So they demonstrated through this description, and this is almost all that they wrote for this under 12. There was, I think, maybe 1 more sentence that we didn't include. But it's a nice, concise summary of the individual cases, the outcomes of those. They did verify that all 52 of those were either corrected or did not need to be corrected based on where the child is now. Any questions about those examples before we go into a general Q&A time? Okay, I'm going to pass this now to Charlene.